I am absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to this webinar, Responses to COVID-19, seen through the lens from strategists. My name is Inge Hill, and I'm one of the facilitators for this meeting. And I am most delighted to very quickly now introduce the panel of 5, and we will introduce them later in more detail. We have a short agenda, but before I go to that, very quickly, we have Richard Lynch here saying hello.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. We have Robert Chia here joining us from Glasgow, I trust. Hello. We have Paula Jodorowsky. Hello.
Hi.
We have Maureen Meadows.
Good afternoon.
And Robert Macintosh. You are muted at the moment, Robert, but that doesn't matter. Welcome also to the over 100 participants from at least 20 countries, so I was told from the BAM office. We are delighted and humbled that you show so much interest to being here today and with us at this moment in time. We will be delighted to entertain and hopefully offer you something to mull over once this webinar is over. I will start sharing my screen with you to share some slides with you, back to the one you've seen already, and we'll talk you through how it's all going to work. Who is BAM to start with? BAM is the British Academy of Management, a fantastic learned society with several thousands members in the UK, but members come from many other countries as well. I am delighted to be at the moment the chair of one of the 22 special interest groups we have, and this is the strategy special interest group I'm currently chair of. A couple of things, how do we work? We are an immensely, so we find friendly community, very supportive of each other, very collaborative, and that makes us as a community so effective overall in BAM, particularly in the strategy SIG. We had a meeting at the beginning of the lockdown, came up with a number of webinar ideas, and we are now running our second one, and the colleagues thought it was good to open it up to a wider audience. Enough about the strategy SIG. Two more things in one go is we have 2 tracks at our annual conference, a great offer BAM does every year, which attracts hundreds of people from all over the world, and ours are general strategy and strategy as practice. Facilitators. I'm Inge Hill, and I have a portfolio career in industry with own consultancy work and working in HE for a number of years. One of the things I enjoy doing is actually working as an assessor for the Small Business Charter run by the Chartered Association of Business Schools, and my area of research is strategic management. You will meet later as part of the discussions my colleague Alan Tate, who is also committee member, a strategist, senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth, and his research interests are process and practice lens on strategy, and particularly implications of uncertainty and ongoing change for strategy making. So what will we be doing during the 90 minutes we have? We've nearly finished with the welcome and introductions. The first part is that each of our 5 panelists will do a short statement introducing his or her lens on what they see is happening from a strategy viewpoint right now, and this will be followed up by questions between panelists. And part B is we will answer your questions, and as we are a very large group of people, the way this is going to work and has worked successfully for other large events, please post your questions while you go along in the Q&A function, which you will find either at the bottom or the top of your screen. Alan and myself will collect them and possibly group them by themes, and we will post them to the panel. So if you have a question only for one panelist, just put the name in, such as for Robert or Maureen. If you have it for all panelists, just say for all panelists, and we will read out your questions to the panel in that second part. We might not be able to answer all questions, however, rest assured, we will provide you with a written answer that is then available either via email or on our Strategy SIG portal on the web for you to look up any questions and answers that we couldn't answer during our meeting. just to kick off, and then we go into the challenges. I've heard in this discussion around COVID-19, as an incentive, what was the word strategy? And then underneath, this is a headline, it says something about a plan to rebuild and a roadmap. Therefore, we invite the panel to tell their view of, is strategy really the word that is being used in the most effective way? I'm delighted to introduce the first panelist, Professor Robert Macintosh. His background is very interesting, with a PhD in engineering, and he then joined the social sciences and management. His area of specialism is strategy and change-related work. He has varied careers and successes in consulting assignments outside of academia, inasmuch as senior leadership positions in a number of universities. Currently, he is head of the School for Social Sciences at Heriot-Watt University, and also chairs a charity in Scotland, Turning Point. He is also chair of the Association of Business Schools and a BAM Council member. A very active life you have, Robert, indeed. His research interest span the work on board-level strategy formation and execution for the last 3 decades. Specifically, his research is informed by processual and complexity theory. He has also published widely on relevance and research methods in management. And he also would like to share with us that in his true spare time, he loves sports, and in particular, Aberdeen Football Club, which he thinks might just undermine his credibility. I couldn't comment on a Burnley fan, so over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Inga. It's lovely to be here this afternoon, and I'd like to say hello. It's always great to be invited to be a panelist on strategy. It's always disappointing to not even be the best robber on the panel, so it's lovely to see my colleague Robert Chia in the background. And we were saying in the pre-meeting that we're going from the least interesting proposition to the most interesting, so I'm simply the warm-up act. I am, however, going to do my product placement. You've already heard that I'm chair of the Chartered Association of Business Schools, and I chair an organisation called Turning Point Scotland. And so if you see me drinking from my mug, it's not for refreshment, it's simply product placement. So it's a great pleasure to be here for the afternoon. And the question that Inga started with is strategy the right word? And my question reframed is, when is strategy not the right word? Strategy is almost always the right word. It's the thing which determines what organizations and societies do. I've been looking at strategy and how it's developed and formed over a very long period of time, usually by observing leadership teams in situ over time. So by observing board meetings, speaking to people individually, and then hanging around in the margins of the organization to try and understand what's going on, how ideas get taken up, and how ideas get sidelined. And that's largely informed by a perspective from complexity theory about how things pick up and get traction in a non-linear way, and how things get marginalized. One of the things that complexity theory tells you, of course, is that big change often requires some kind of big interruption. It's what the literature calls a period of disequilibrium, or far from equilibrium conditions. It's a thing I've been writing about for a long time. It would be fair to say that a global pandemic represents a fairly big and systemic interruption to everything that we do. And I think that that is really a fascinating period for us to study what happens in the response to COVID. In another part of my life, I am just about to launch a survey of Scottish organisations on behalf of the Scottish Government, looking at how organisations imagine themselves to be in 3 to 5 years' time based on what they're experiencing just now. And so I thought I would just share with you a few thoughts about remoteness and its impact on the strategy formation process. Having spent a couple of decades watching boards form strategy in boardrooms, it's quite unusual to be involved in my own organisations, either at Heriot-Watt or in Turning Point Scotland or the Chartered ABS, in our boardrooms, which have all of a sudden become virtual, and how that impacts on governance and decision making. Some of which has actually oddly been informed by some work that I had been doing pre-COVID on the use of video diaries to try and understand the distributed nature of strategy making. So Inga, if we could move forward one slide, that would be great. So this is an excerpt from a paper about video diaries. And it struck me as being apposite for my experience of the last few weeks of remote working. Here is somebody who was asked to upload a video diary saying, quite honestly, this is the third time I've done this, and the first couple of times it didn't go badly, but I was 12 minutes in, and that's really, really annoying. And that sense, with the swear words included in the original publication, of it being really annoying, is one of the things that strikes me about remote working. You know, you get to a key point in the discussion and it freezes, or your signal drops out, or some of those challenges are going to be, I think, a part of how we study strategy going forward. Where strategy happens, who is involved, and how it is mediated is changing before our eyes, in my view, and that seems to be a very interesting phenomenon. Could we go forward another slide, Inga? This picture is actually a real picture. It looks like it's a fake or an imagined picture, but it's a real village somewhere in Iceland. And it is not, as I said, altered. It's a 3D painting on the road, which was part of an experiment to try and see if they could reduce the number of traffic accidents. And as you look at it, it looks almost as if the person crossing the road is floating in free space. In fact, they're just standing on the tarmac. If you Google this, and I'll see if I could find a link and share it with you, but there's an excellent YouTube video of somebody from a car dashboard driving towards this. And what happens is that the optical illusion changes as you head towards it, and it has the natural effect of slowing you down. And so I found myself thinking about, when we think about strategy making and we think about the organizational setting, there is something similar going on in our sense of organization, that the real and the imagined and the illusionary overlap with each other in different ways as we speak. So could we go forward one more slide, Ingrid?
No, there wasn't any.
Oh, that's my last slide. So what I was minded to conclude with in this question about what's going on in the COVID environment is that the nature of our governance arrangements are changing. And for many years, I've watched organizations try to develop inclusive approaches to strategy, and they do things like host workshops with their employees and their stakeholders to seek views. My own organisation that I chair in the charitable sector, called Turning Point Scotland, just had a meeting of every member of staff in Zoom, all 1,250 staff in a Zoom meeting. And that strikes me as being quite a different form of inclusive strategy making that we don't yet fully understand. The practicalities are now that everybody could be involved in everything, at least in some shape or form. That doesn't mean to say that it's an entirely democratic process. It might still be a dictatorship, or at best maybe a benign dictatorship, because some people have more influence and power in the decision making than others. But it's now no longer possible to say, I never heard them say that they were going to stop doing this or start doing that, because you were invited to the digital Zoom. The chat facility in these technologies is amazing, because you can now see in real time who's thinking what, in a way that would actually be socially quite rude in a face-to-face meeting, because, hey, I'm speaking, what the hell are you doing? Typing. But in Zoom or Teams or these equivalent platforms, the multiplicity and plurivocal nature of strategy is actually displayed to us as researchers in ways that have been hidden from view. And I find myself thinking, wow, I've spent decades trying to carefully piece together the pieces of a jigsaw, which are actually tipped out onto the table almost pre-assembled for you in cyberspace. So the thing that I'd be really interested to hear my panelists' views on as we go forward are actually the strategy process itself and the research methods we might use to try and capture and understand that strategy process in a post-COVID environment. And having done the warm-up act, I'll hand back to Inga, who then passes on to a much better speaker, and they'll get gradually better, folks, as we go along. So next up is Paula.
Sorry about that. This was the timer, and it's much louder than it should be.
But it just shows that I was on time, Inga.
You were indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed, Robert. Most intriguing, lots of questions I have already arising, and we look forward to hearing more in the discussion. Our next panelist is Professor Paula Jadowskowski. She's currently Professor of Strategic Management at Cass Business School, City University in London, and also at the University of Queensland Business School. Paula's research is very much focusing on practice of strategy and markets in complex and pluralistic contexts. The exciting thing is what you can see here. She has written a number of fantastic publications and books. The first book on strategy as practice, an activity-based approach, was published in 2005. The latest book, where you see the cover of the book there, I thought the title, Making a Market for Acts of God, is most intriguing at these strange times right now. She enjoys the challenge of publishing ethnographic and practice theoretical work in many leading journals, of which I've read quite a few indeed. Over to you, Paula. Looking forward to your statement.
Thanks, Inga. I thought that what I would do is just perhaps get Inga to show my slide and the points I'm going to talk to briefly. And then if you'd all like my big face on the screen instead of a slide for a little while, if you want to stop sharing for a little bit, Inga, I was just going to give people a little bit of a break from PowerPoint and chat to them.
Okay, I can do that, most certainly.
Yeah. So I think the things that as a practice scholar, one of the papers, so one of the things that we've been, sorry, that's, there are many of us working from home at these times, and I'm not the only one in this house. So yes, so we wrote a paper, in fact, and it's one of the ambitions of strategist practice to look at the practitioners of strategy. And 2007 editorial we did in Human Relations was precisely about who is a strategy and what is the doing of strategy. And I think that, I already think that strategist practice has fallen a little short of that, in that it was meant to open up the possibilities of who is a strategist and what kind of work is strategy. But much of our research has continued to look at the usual suspects, you know, the senior managers and the middle managers, with a little kind of odd foray outside that occasionally into, you know, one or two studies of lower level employees. I think that's because, of course, when you go to look at what is strategy, you tend to take something that is already defined as strategy within the organization, or that is apparently strategic, and that's usually something that a top manager will point you as, or something that a middle manager is required to implement. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment, where no top manager would have designed this, not even Jeff Bezos, who's making a killing out of it, could have actually foreseen and designed this and said, that's going to be my strategy, a world pandemic that makes me the only provider. So in that sense, I think we were always trying to aim to open it up to see where strategic things come from and to understand what kind of work is strategic as in important, and that we have an opportunity while this is going on to reinvent our work as scholars and to think about what we mean by the term strategic and maybe remove it from what is really a fairly a view that is grounded in the notion that the only type of strategy that is relevant is one that in some way gets a small number of variables to relate to a spurious performance outcome. I say spurious because we've often celebrated the success of companies, which we've later had to suck our stomachs in a little bit and go, that wasn't quite as successful as I thought. Actually, turns out some of it was just fraudulent. So in that sense, I think we have a chance when we go outside our houses and we see shop workers, we see garbage collectors, we are able to see that the power grid keeps running, that the water keeps flowing from our taps, and that if these things did not happen, we wouldn't have a society. That perhaps the people whose work is strategic, or that the doing of strategy is actually occurring within things that are incredibly mundane, that we overlook, that we consider unimportant, relatively lowly rewarded, and perhaps not the decision making, not the important stuff. And yet it turns out the important stuff that we can't do without when we're all locked up at home is in fact much of that very mundane work. So one of the appeals I have and the questions I have to all of us here, not just my fellow panelists, but there's some great minds here today. As Robert so kindly pointed out, we're going from the worst to the best. So you've still got plenty of good thoughts coming after me, is how can we better incorporate that into strategy analysis? And therefore, how do we understand what are the doings of strategy? Now, another thing that I'm going to have to take issue with myself as a practice scholar is that I've always believed in the endogeneity of explanations. And the way that we practice scholars tend to talk about this is we talk about the civil rights movement and we talk about the Rosa Parks moment, meaning that for a lot of people, the civil rights movement started when Rosa Parks sat on the bus in a space where people of colour were not allowed to sit. But of course, that's a very exogenous kind of disruptive theory of the civil rights movement, because in fact, she was not the first person to sit on a bus. It just happens that somehow the accretion of practices towards civil rights manifested at that time, but it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. We need to trace all the straws to understand the breaking of the back. We need to trace all the actions that make the one woman's sitting at a moment in time the significant one. Now, because I'm a practice scholar and I believe in that theory as an explanation of the world, and aside from which, you know, I'm a scholar, I've got to bash the data till it fits my theory. I believe there must be an endogenous explanation to the position we find ourselves in. But I've got to say it feels pretty exogenous and disruptive to me. So how are we going to build those theoretical perspectives together between the notion of Robert talked about, you know, equilibrium and, you know, disruption and things. My question is, how will we bring together this endogenous explanations of a world that's got itself so connected that it falls apart, at the same time as perhaps acknowledging that there is for the notion of disruption. The other thing I think we're going to have to be careful about is notions of success and performance. There will be many people who reconstruct what's going on now around, oh, the successful charities that pivoted. You know, we've all seen, indeed I myself have paid a donkey sanctuary to turn up on my Zoom meetings, you know. So if you can't get people to come through the gate paying money for your donkey sanctuary, you pivot by selling your donkeys to Zoom. We're going to have lots of great stories of pivoting and agility, and success is all about that. But really, we are retrospectively reconstructing people who were lucky and so forth. Anyway, it's time to stop, but I guess the only thing I'd probably like to say, therefore, is I want us to think very seriously about, as we reconstruct business, one action at a time, what kind of success and performance would we like to reconstruct within our actions? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paula. Brilliant. So many questions I can see coming, but also arising. Our next panelist is Professor Richard Lynch. I will go back to the slides, if I remember where I share the screen. There we go. And I'm delighted to have had a chance to meet Richard personally through this activity, as his book in the 8th edition now, Strategic Management, has shaped the lives of many students above and beyond the UK. I'm using it in more than 2 modules right now. Professor Richard Lynch is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Management at Middlesex University in London, and also visiting professor at Portsmouth University right now. He studied in Manchester, Leeds and the London Business School, spent 20 years in industry, and then afterwards 30 years in higher education. A great life to combine these two things. His current research interests, and he is, even though retired, still publishing, are in entrepreneurship and international strategy, deglobalization and knowledge transfer in emerging market and multinationals. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Inga. Can you put up the first slide, please? So I've got, within the topic of COVID-19 and strategy, I think I'm going to take a rather different view of the whole thing. There are various subsidiary lenses, entrepreneurial strategy, global strategy, and so on. And today I want to cover 3 issues through the specific lens of prescriptive and emergent strategies. And you can see the well-known definition on the slide. The 3 issues I want to cover are the strategic concept, a context for business. Secondly, to outline 4 strategies that address that particular context, and then suggest 3 new strategy research areas raised by the pandemic. And you'll see that this is quite different from the 2 other speakers, but that's in my view, that's good news, because we all need to bring different perspectives on these things. So turning to the first issue, there's no doubt that COVID-19 is at the core of the current crisis for many countries around the world. In essence, it's delivering major uncertainty, and the difficulty for strategic management, particularly for prescriptive strategy, is that it assumes the future is predictable. And COVID-19, as Paul and others have suggested, would suggest otherwise. Now, some of you will recognize that I'm not doing myself any favors here, because I have a textbook that, at least in part, makes the assumption of predictability, and maybe I should revise this for future editions, and I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from my colleagues on this webinar and from the audience, people listening and watching this webinar, to see whether I should be doing that. Turning to the second issue, if you could move on to the second slide, please. COVID-19 unpredictability raises the question of whether it's possible to develop effective strategies. And I suggest there are at least 4 possible strategies. First, there's the obvious one, survival strategy through effective leadership, cost cutting and cash flow management, which you'll see in a lot of companies going on at the moment. Second, there is another obvious area, building strategic scenarios. And of course here, the principle behind scenarios is not to predict the future, rather the logic here is to suggest possible combinations of events with their strategy implication, then to apply the relevant choice when the future is better known. There are also 2 longer-term possible strategies. The first involves revisiting the firm's specific competitive advantages with the examples from the topics listed on the slide, and I call this back to basics strategy. This is on the second of the, that's the one, thank you. The second entails seeking opportunities that will inevitably arise from the new situation through the concept of dynamic capabilities and innovation, if it comes to that. And I can elaborate on both of those if people are interested in this area later on. If we could then move to the third of my 3 PowerPoints, please. I want briefly to suggest 3 topics that will benefit from new thinking, new strategies, and possibly some new theories within prescriptive and emergent concepts. First, undoubtedly some firms will disappear as a result of COVID-19, but this is nothing new. Firms have been coming and going for years. What, if anything, makes this COVID-19 different? What insights, if any, are offered by prescriptive and emergent theories? Second, one of the weaknesses of the topic of prescriptive and emergent strategic management is that it's largely based on economic concepts. And this is, ignores the vital human dimension. There are people suffering immensely today as a result of this COVID-19. Economic theory suggests there's also a strategic paradox here. On the one hand, there's a major cost to business if we relieve human suffering by maintaining a lockdown. Conversely, there's a major cost to business if we stop the lockdown too early and then have a likely second wave of virus deaths. However, and perhaps this makes the point really, beyond this economic paradox, I think that prescriptive and emergent strategies need new theoretical insights if they're to help with the human side of COVID-19. And third and finally, because my time is almost up, we mustn't forget the world faces a major fundamental problem, the sustainability of the Earth's resources. This won't go away. Strategic management needs to consider how this must be tackled in the context of COVID-19. And I have no doubt that prescriptive and emergent theories will help in that regard. Thank you very much. Back to you, Inga.
Well, thank you, Richard. Very interesting questions you raised. I'm sure we can talk about. I'll hand over to Alan now, and he is introducing our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Inga. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Professor Robert Chia from Glasgow University, the second Robert on our panel today. He's a professor of management at Glasgow University. He got his PhD in organisational analysis at University of Lancaster under the supervision of Bob Cooper, I believe. He is an author of many books, including Strategy Without Design, and is published widely in a number of high-ranking articles. His research is underpinned by a process philosophical worldview that interrogates strategy practices, strategy making, peripheral awareness, organisational foresight, decisions and unintended consequences, the educational role of university business schools, and East-West mentalities and their implications for business practice. Robert is from Singapore, and prior to entering academia, he worked for 17 years in shipbuilding, aircraft engineering, and held senior management positions in manufacturing and human resources for a large multinational corporation based in Singapore. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Robert.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. Could I have next my slides, please? Next slide, please. I thought that since we are interested in responses to COVID-19, I thought it might be good to have a look at the kind of a slide that shows how various countries have responded. If you look at the top row showing in green, Estonia, Greece, Iceland, and on the other side, Vietnam and Thailand and Taiwan, sorry, have been doing pretty well. And if you look at the right-hand bottom corner, that's where US and the UK are at the moment, or probably about a few days ago. The question that comes to mind is, despite the fact that we claim we have followed a science-driven approach to dealing with this COVID problem, how is it that we seem to be not performing as well in our strategy? Well, I guess, next slide, please. I guess the truth is that scientific understanding in a fast-moving situation like this is not easily attainable. And one has to remember that scientists are themselves human beings. They make sometimes they make questionable epistemological assumptions, and they develop their theories, and in the end, very often they become very dogmatic about their own concepts and models. So one of the consequences, they end up overlooking very practical things like supply of face masks, PPEs, testing, tracing, and so forth. So the real problem we are facing at the moment here is a kind of radical uncertainty surrounding this virus, about its forms, the population it attacks, its modes of transmission, and so forth. Next slide, please. So given this kind of context, a pragmatic approach to strategizing is really what's needed. There are no ready-made roadmaps to follow. The information that's coming out is unclear, incomplete, unreliable, and even conflicting. The Prime Minister has colorfully described this as like being mugged. Well, that's true, but if you are actually being mugged, what's the first thing you do? You don't say, hold on a minute, let me get and so that I can shine it upon you and see who you are. No, what you do is you react, you kick, you run, you bite, you scratch, and you act. In other words, you act first without thinking, and that's the basis for strategic wayfinding. Next slide, please. So you rely on your senses. Not on cognition, not on representations. You depend on keen observation of what's really going on, seeking out and discerning the differences that make a difference, and then acting on those points that afford some level of purchase to give you an advantage. And this is the wayfinding approach, the modus operandi to strategic wayfinding. It's about action overkill, basically. I'm a Singaporean, and in Singapore we have a term called kiasu. This is actually now in the Oxford Dictionary, by the way. You can look it up. It means basically that you overdo. Kiasu means afraid to lose out. So when you're afraid to lose out, you do more than is necessary. That's what you do. So you literally throw the kitchen sink at the mugger, so to speak. And this includes, of course, masks. it has taken 6 weeks for us to come to this point where we decided masks are necessary. Now, the questions that the experts are asking is the wrong one. They are saying, they are agonizing about how much good it can do. That's a wrong question. The question should be, do masks exacerbate the situation? If they don't, wear it, because that makes, so it's a negative rather than a positive. What Sir Paul Nurse calls a Dunkirk approach to these things. Yeah? Every ship, small, big, or anything, you throw at the virus, and that's and you wait for the feedback. Okay, can I have next slide, please? This is what countries like Taiwan did. Country with 24 million. The moment it had a few cases, it initiated 124 action items, including border closure, building up stocks of masks, using sanitizers, social distancing, wearing of masks, and so forth. The result is 440 cases and 7 deaths. Next slide, please. But even more impressive is Vietnam, a population of 95 million, low income, densely populated, long border with China, relatively underdeveloped healthcare. They didn't have the benefit of luxury of fancy technology or sophisticated science. All they did was the basic things like social distancing, testing, wherever they could. They are not the highest on testing at all. Masks, sanitizers, check temperatures at every entrance to every building. That's really what strategic wayfinding is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. And now, with great pleasure, I think if we have the next slide, Inga, and move on to our final panellist, Professor Maureen Meadows, who's the co-vice chair of all interest groups at the British Academy of Management at the moment. But she's also a professor of strategic management at Coventry University. She's a co-leader of the research cluster on data organisations and society. Her research interests include strategic decision-making and big data analytics, privacy and surveillance, the use of strategy tools, including scenario planning and visioning, and mergers and acquisitions and strategic alliances. Without further ado, I'll pass you over to Maureen.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I think it's great that the 5 of us have taken such different perspectives. You see, you give 5 academics the same question and they come up with completely different things, which hopefully makes it a really interesting session. I'm just going to pick on three key issues that for me have been bubbling under in the press recently, and I bring 2 lenses to this, I suppose. First of all, a strategist practice lens, which Paul has already introduced so beautifully, but I'm interested in what keeps, to use that cliche, what keeps managers awake at night? What are the practical issues that some of this, the current crisis is raising in our organisations? My other lens, well known to all strategists, is resources and capabilities. So I guess what I'd like to argue over the next couple of minutes is that the crisis has, for me, really highlighted some issues of where I think we don't understand and manage our resources as well as we can in organisations, and where I think we need to develop capabilities in some areas. And I think our managers and our organisations still need some help, and that's a challenge to us. So I'm going to pick just 3. My next slide is about supply chains and fast-moving alliances. So what I'm really interested in is strategic alliances and the relationships between organisations. I have colleagues who study supply chains, and they're fascinated because supply chain isn't normally a very hot topic, shall we say, a little bit boring. Suddenly, you get a crisis like COVID, and the management of supply chains is a really important issue, including to members of the public. If you go into the supermarket and the shops are bare, the shelves are bare, or at least for certain products, which we were potentially facing a few weeks ago. It's not just about food, of course, is it? Our organisations today have global supply chains in many areas. For me as a strategist, I look at this through the management of alliances. I think that our organisations, the organisations I'm talking to, probably still not as good as we should be at thinking about the dynamic ecosystems that we're all operating in, and what alliances look like in the future, how they have to be fast moving, rapidly changing. Organizations have to get better. Here's a capability. We have to get better at building, managing, and potentially dissolving alliances. So that's my first capability that I think is highlighted. If I could have the next one, please, please, Inga. My second one is around reputation management at times of crisis. It's very easy to take a pop at Virgin Atlantic and Richard Branson, isn't it? And the media have certainly been doing that recently. The serious point for me, and there are many other organisations that perhaps their reputation hasn't done very well recently, maybe because of the way they've managed their staff. So our football clubs have been criticised about furloughing some of the low paid staff and so on. My serious point is that there's an intangible resource there about reputation and brand and image that most of the organisations I deal with are still struggling with, how to think about that resource and how to manage it well. There are some real issues around understanding trustworthiness and legitimacy, how to maintain it, how to win it back if you make a mistake and you lose it. So I think there's a really important capability there around reputation management, which our organisations need some help at getting better in that area as well. Thank you, Inga. My third example is around data, one of my research interests, as Alan said, at Coventry University. Big data has been in the news, as it always is, but again recently in relation to the tracking apps, the pros and cons of the different tracking apps that are in place around the world. On the one hand, they may help us with our public health and our management of the virus. On the other hand, for campaigners around privacy and surveillance, this could present a slippery slope or an area where data that's gathered for one purpose is potentially used for other purposes. So I think there's a real paradox and a real challenge there for our organisations in terms of, on the one hand, maximising value from big data, as they are, I think, still learning to do. On the other hand, behaving ethically and respecting personal data and privacy in a digital era. So those are my three challenges or areas where I think organisations are struggling to build their capabilities, and that's highlighted by COVID. Just to sum up, Inga, if I could have my final slide, just sums up on those three. So short-term alliances in fast-moving ecosystems, learning about how to protect organisational reputation, particularly when we're innovating and moving at speed, that needs good governance. And issues around big data, on the one hand seeking to maximise value, on the other hand respecting privacy and personal data. If I've got a few seconds, I'd just like to throw in a final one on the bottom of the slide there, which is around a strategy tool which has been close to my heart for a long time, which is scenario planning. We look at this crisis and we hear from the experts, the politicians, the civil servants, that some scenario planning and wargaming, as they like to call it, was done a few years ago, 2015, 2016, around a global health pandemic. We also hear that the findings of that exercise were not acted upon, were not carried through into strategic planning in terms of, nobody was saying we should be building warehouses with, with ventilators and PPE, or perhaps having organisations in place to produce those things quickly if we needed them. So I think there's a real challenge for us as strategists, again, about how our beloved tools that we teach our MBA students and so on, how those are really embedded in organisations so that when they're used, they're of real value to the good run, the smooth running of that organisation in the future. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Inga.
Thank you very much, Maureen, and thank you to all the panelists for their opening presentations. The kind of things I'm hearing is that you have a changing business, a reconstructing business. You're challenging the prescriptive way, the planning way of doing strategy and looking for new ways of doing strategy. It raises a question to me that I would like to pose to the whole panel. Are we looking at a tipping point towards a new way of doing strategy? And if so, what does that mean for the practicing strategist? would anyone
So
like
do you want me to start, Alan, by answering that? I think what it means for the practicing strategist now is the idea of inclusion has been broadened significantly in the last 7 or 8 weeks. And so the idea that you could simply say, we, the top team, went away to an exotic location and, you know, played a round of golf, thought great thoughts, had a shiatsu massage and did our strategy away day, and that we then consulted you by, you know, sticking a note in the newsletter or hosting one meeting somewhere, that just doesn't feel plausible to me. I think the communitarian sense in which our organisation is a living, breathing thing matters much more now because people have a sense of participation that they've never had before. And I think some of the thoughts that I have is that some of the way in which people's perceptions shaped their sense of reality, just in the examples that Robert or Maureen gave, are very true. You know, when nobody had heard this phrase herd immunity, suddenly it gets traction, then it gets informed as so we should give up social distancing in order so that enough of us can get unwell that we can all get well. And then we get this sense of that's a really bad idea. In a pretty quick product life cycle for an idea, you know, introduction, maturity, and decline in the space of, you know, a few weeks. And I think that our strategy making needs to reflect that speed and fleetness of foot, but it has to do so in a genuinely participative way. That would be my answer.
If I may add a lot with what Robert is saying, if I may add on that, I think what's really critical is grounding any attempt to develop a strategy. What Wittgenstein calls back to the rough ground of what's really going on, immersing ourselves in that as a starting point, extracting information from that, and then building strategy on the go, so to speak. Because the developments, as you can see, I mean, 2.5 months ago or so, we were not even thinking in these terms. The whole world has been turned upside down because of this little thing, some small. Here, Robert, I was thinking to myself when you were talking about complexity, it just goes to show how a little eating of perhaps, I don't know, maybe bats or whatever, in some remote place which is miles away from where we are, has now come to affect the whole world. This is this reminiscence, this butterfly effect that we have always alluded to, isn't it? Huh? It's not a butterfly flapping its wings in Beijing, causing a thunderstorm in Janeiro, but it is certainly a butterfly flapping somewhere there that's causing the world this massive problem for us now.
Yeah, Paula?
Yeah, I mean, I like the notion that the bat's wings in China. Thanks for that, Robert. Robert 1 and Robert 2. I think that there's a couple of things. What is most apparent to me, and I think a little distressing, is that there could well be arising from this a tendency to go back to localization, or at very least regionalization. In some ways, that's kind of the systemic nature of this has indicated some of the dangers of the very efficient strategies that we've come up with, the just-in-times in the supply chains, the globally connected, the outsourcing to the cheapest place, has made us very frail and vulnerable in our local contexts when that collapses. And we see that a couple of countries that are very far from the world and have been able to close their borders very effectively, such as places like New Zealand, you know, that what we may be seeing is this kind of pull to localization. And on the one hand, I think that produces a more participative and more opportunities for people within that local region. On the other hand, I'd be reluctant to see us lose many of the wonderful advances of globalization in terms of connectivity. So I hope we can strike some both and balance between that. The other thing that I am fearful of, I agree with Robert 1, I'm just doing it in the order of their going, that everyone is able to participate now more and more directly. People are sending questions as we go. But on the other hand, I also fear that the inequity that will rise from this will put much more power into the hands of those who have the right to give or take away jobs We already know that surveillance has increased through this. So this is my point. I think we have to make what we want, and we as strategy scholars have to be selling what we believe is good strategy going forward. And that can't be winner takes all and make returns, because it will reinforce inequities that will already be so exacerbated by this, by this crisis.
Richard?
Yeah, I think to address your question specifically, Alan, that I personally think that the basic concepts of strategy, surrounding competitive environment and so on, still remain. And I referred to it briefly when I made the comment about back to basics strategy. I could just explain that for 1 second. I remember years ago, I worked in a company where the vice chairman was very proud to announce one day that they had just bought an IBM mainframe, which had to sit in a special room and so on and so forth. Now that mainframe has the same capacity as the computer that's sitting below me here on the south coast. And my point being that what then happened with IBM was that it realized that mainframes were no longer the business of the future, and it needed to reinvent itself and go back to what did it do basically that was good, and that still maintained areas of competitive advantage. For example, its reputation, which Maureen referred to, which I totally support. For example, its network of contacts in the IT field, and so on and so forth. Now, those sorts of things, it seems to me, as companies come to rethink where they're going in the context of this major crisis, I think the starting point should still be, no, it's not a tipping point towards some totally new strategy. It's who are our customers? How can we get back to them? How can we compete? And so on and so forth. So I'm still in favor of existing concepts insofar as they help.
And Maureen, finally, any comments?
Yes, thanks, Alan. I agree with what Richard's just said. I think we're still figuring out how to bring different stakeholders into a strategy process effectively. I mean, I think Robert Wan, as he's now known, raised strategy process quite at the beginning of the session. The examples I've raised bring out the importance of bringing your people, your customers, into your strategy process, whether it's because you're holding their personal data, or whether it's because your reputation and your trustworthiness and your legitimacy as an organization depends on your relationship with those individuals. And as I said earlier, I think we're still figuring out how to manage that. And also in an era when our alliances and our supply chains and all of those business to business relationships look different too, and are potentially changing rapidly. Again, I don't think we've quite figured out how to bring those kinds of partners into our strategy processes. So I think, I think we do need to rethink how the strategy process works, how those conversations work, and how we get to a good strategy that draws on all of those parties that are crucial to its success. That would be my thought.
Excellent, thanks very much. Maybe, have you got any questions you would directly like to ask each other based on the presentations you've given before we then pass on to the audience questions? If that is not the case, I'll start off with some questions that builds very well on what Maureen just said. Particularly, there are some questions about the concept of strategy and teaching of strategy. So I've grouped a few questions in the meantime. For example, Robert Wright asked, first of all, thank you very much for an exhilarating webinar. Well, we are glad you enjoy it. What has become so obvious globally is how unprepared we all were with the invisible COVID-19. What lessons does all this teach us about how we are not educating our past, current, and future generation of thought leaders?
So I'll start as Robert the First, Alpha Robert, Robert, the less well published or less intelligent? I'm happy to go with any of the above, really, in honour of my great friend and former colleague, his Robertness of Chia. The thing that it strikes me in answer to Robert Wright's question is that it tells us that we just go round the loop again. I think we are slightly guilty in our MBA programs and in our classrooms of saying, if we'd only done scenario planning well, like they did when we were doing the oil price collapse of 1973 or whatever, then it would be all okay. And what we find each time we do that is that a new type of problem has come up that we have no category for. And I'm very struck by this sense of problem framing being difficult because we have no point of reference for this. I have sat in meetings with members of the Scottish Government 3 or 4 years ago where some of the senior health professionals in the country were saying the one thing that they were most worried about was a global pandemic. And yet that didn't land, you know. And I am sure that in the great offices of Shell, who are held as the Uber case study for scenario planning, that there'll be, and I have actually heard from one very senior Shell executive about Kees van der Heijden and the other strategy scenario planners from within Shell. Nobody really listened to them. We kind of just let them do their thing. So I'm not so convinced necessarily that the answer is just scenario planning. I think that the answer isn't always about predicting, it's about the nimbleness of the response. I think that's the main thing for me, because the next thing that hits us won't be coronavirus 20, a slight variant of the new thing. It'll be a different version of a different kind of problem.
Robert.
Yeah, well, if I may, sort of, I entirely agree with Robert that it's about nimbleness, about fleet-footedness. When something happens, you have to be able to say, look, this is something different. And in fact, if you remember the doctor who died in China, he was the one who triggered off this possibility that this was a slightly different virus, you know. But unfortunately, it wasn't taken up immediately, and that lost us some time, I have to say. Now, but for the rest of us in this part of the world, we actually had a bit of lead time, and we didn't make use of that. You know, we didn't actually. I happened to be in Singapore, and I came back on the 20th of January. But by that time, I had heard about all these little things. Do you know, when I went to my office on the 26th of January, my colleague, Wee Meng, who's from Singapore as well, handed me a box of face masks, a box of 50, January 26th. This is how you think about these things, you know. And I have to say, the idea that we move so slowly in getting all these things is just reflects not the issues about strategy, but the strategy is worthless without the responsiveness.
Thank you. Yes, Paula.
Now, I think that, you know, I've also seen the sort of stuff that shows that we knew pandemics were coming, that pandemics could do these things. You know, it's I think, very easy to say, well, we knew about this, so we should have done something, and to blame in when we're in the situation, which ignores the kind of natural short-term, long-term. I study big disasters. We all know big disasters are coming. I mean, we're sitting here watching the disaster of climate change rushing towards us, and everybody's saying somebody should do something, ignoring the tensions between short and long term that are going on here. So short-term political cycles, short-time personal cycles, short-time ways of framing versus something that's long-term. Even when we know something is quite close and could happen to us, we tend to privilege the short-term. So I think that a key point about strategy, and I do a lot of work in paradox, is working out ways to balance interests that are short-term and long-term. Because if a country had begun in November last year, it appears, if we can believe the mysterious data, that there was evidence that some people died in Paris of this disaster in December because they've gone back and done some swabs. If somebody had suggested that they locked down Paris at that stage, there would have been rioting in the streets. You see, so the point is, it's very easy. And also, like, I mean, a lot of the work I look at is we know that if we create more resilient infrastructure, we will be more resistant to climate change. This country actually had 3 named storms and massive flooding at the start of this year. We're no longer talking about it, but that flooding was known, that flooding was coming because nobody has put in any infrastructure in the Environment Agency. It will come again and it will continue to. But the cost of putting it for the politicians and the people whose taxes must pay for it seem to be too far out. We don't want to pay for resilience that may or may not prevent a disaster. And we will never know if it did because the disaster didn't happen. So that was a bad use of money because the disaster didn't happen. So I think on the one hand, we kid ourselves that scenario planning takes us into some future. And that actually what we really need is perhaps to start looking at the multiple paradoxes and contradictions surrounding this. And how is it that we can somehow at least acknowledge and bring out all these interests in order to be able to negotiate, if not shared understanding, sufficiently common ground to move forward. And that's a very much more pluralistic society than I think we're used to.
If there are no further questions to this.
Can I just, I'm not a great advocate of scenario planning because I think the idea of best case and worst case scenarios and so forth are not terribly helpful. But I think the cultivating of scenario thinking is very important. Scenarios thinking is about developing agility of the mind, mental agility, that some things are possible. It's about heightening peripheral awareness. And that's important because then you see the signals coming through, weak signals, as they say, coming through, and you note those weak signals and are mindful of the possibility that these could actually become major catastrophes.
That links well with a question Hazel Hind asked here. If the new normal is a continuum of disruption and black swan scenarios, how do we become agile as an operational baseline? To the whole panel.
Can I perhaps begin by suggesting one of the things we've not really talked about on the discussion today is the whole area of innovation and innovative strategy. And it seems to me that the whole basis of the coronavirus epidemic has suggested that we really need to rethink the resources that we have in relation to what may or may not occur. And that means, it seems to me also, developing out new areas and new ideas. And that the process of doing that is something that seems to me to be unclear at the moment, but something that is fundamental to the way that we need to move forward. And with regard to these sorts of areas, I think the other thing we've not talked about, of course, is that some strategy contexts, some of the coronavirus is specific to some very specific contexts, the hospitality industry and so on, for example, which is in a particularly difficult situation. And again, here as an example, there are whole areas of innovation there that it seems to me that people are beginning to think about, and the practicality of that is something that I think we need to explore much more.
Yes, Maureen.
Just to comment on, partly to build on Robert Chia's remark about scenario thinking, which I think is, is absolutely right, Inga. It's that strategic thinking that builds robustness and agility in a mindset. For me, with the organisations that I've seen recently, there's still a very big step between strategy formulation and strategy implementation. So we can recognise that certain tactics, certain activities might be good to do, but for all the reasons that Paula referred to around short-term financials and personal agendas and so on, those actions don't get carried through. So I'm always interested in the relationship between the strategy and the strategic activity in an organisation and the different functional areas, the finance, the marketing, the operations, and again, I think we're still learning how to, in some ways, how to embed strategy effectively. So it's not something completely separate from the rest of the organisation. It's actually embedded into those functions so that implementation happens and so that decisions actually get made and carried through, and there's buy-in to some of the strategic thinking that tools like scenarios and other tools can actually provoke. That would be my thought.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, just to say from the question about the question, Taleb actually calls this a white swan. He doesn't think it's a black swan. And the reason why he thinks it's a white swan is because it is not entirely unthinkable. As you probably know, Bill Gates and quite a few other people have already broached this possibility, but these issues were on the periphery of our understanding or concern, so to speak. So they are not entirely black swans in this. He calls it a white swan, and I agree with him.
Yes, Robert.
So from Robert the Cleverer to Robert the First, I think that the thing that strikes me is this, the way in which we describe this is this new normal. The undercurrent of the question is, you know, in this increasingly disrupted black swan, you know, uncharted territory world. My view is it's not that new, actually. We've been in this space for a while. So just think about the chronology, because some of us around the virtual room are process scholars. The strategy is all about timing. I think had this pandemic landed maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we would have been better prepared, oddly, because 2 or 3 years ago, there were stockpiles of PPE because there was a robustness in the healthcare system that had been thought about on the basis of a potential pandemic. And with the austerity drive that results from a previous disruption in the collapse of the financial markets, people began to say, Jinx, this is not going to happen. It's the chicken licking story of the sky is not falling in. We don't need piles of PPE stuff in a cupboard somewhere for a health board that's never used it. And I'm certainly not buying more now that it's out of date. And so we went from a position of being quite prepared to a position of being less prepared, actually. And that just indicates to me that this is not a one-off transition from a very stable world to a scary, highly disrupted world. It's just the latest and probably biggest of a series of these things, which is forcing us to think differently. And I think it's forcing us to think differently as strategy scholars in terms of what we think strategy looks like and how we might study it and what theories we use. But it's also fundamentally asking us to think about what it is that we're maximizing. And I am increasingly of the view that we are not just maximizing shareholder value here, and that the communitarian process that's going on and the transparency of that, because of the technology actually, and because of the size of the disruption, will shift our thinking.
If there is no further answer to that question, here are a couple of questions that look at the role of academics as an outcome of the crisis. Jacqueline Davis, for example, asks, and I have another question similar, for all, the rhetoric around COVID-19 research acknowledges the need for new ways of thinking theories. However, historically, peer-reviewed journals lean towards established theoretical approaches. This presents a challenge for academics on whether they should be brave with their research at the expense of a successful publication, unless peer-reviewed journals are willing to be brave too. What are your thoughts about bridging this gap? And another question is similar mode from Nicholas Regan. What are, in your view, the lessons for the future of UK universities and business schools from a strategic perspective? So it's the kind of implications for us as academics. Yes, Robert Macintosh.
So can I pick up on Nicholas Reagan's question, first of all, because I think it's one of the big challenges we as a sector face. I am absolutely convinced of the transformative power of higher education. It's a fantastic thing. It has become a global industry. And yet there was a really powerful piece in Times Higher the other day, which said, you know, if it turns out that the best place in the world to teach 101 strategy is one of our institutions, let's say it's Maureen's or Alan's or yours, Inga, what's the difference between having 100 students in your lecture theatre on your campus and having a bazillion students in your Zoom lecture theatre digitally? You know, the question about how we do that challenges us to think quite differently. And I wrote a piece in response in part in Times Higher, which appeared the other day, which argued for a new localism, but not parochialism. And so I think each of our business schools in each of our home universities is an immense engine of goodwill and innovation and economic development in its local economic setting. And there's a real argument for being being right on the money with the latest thinking and the best educational processes and the best research. But I think there's going to be a renewed emphasis on what difference that makes to the organisations, public, private and charitable, around your organisation and how connected you are with your civic mission. I think that's the thing that's going to shift. I think the educational practice itself will become, I'm increasingly of the view, why on earth I go back to a half-empty lecture theatre and dosing students when I could do it digitally? Get better engagement, better participation, it's more efficient. But I do think that the relationship between the student, the university and its economic setting locally, what we have a challenge as business schools to do is to position business school graduates in the way that nursing and medical schools have positioned their graduates as getting to the front line. Where's the economic recovery front line that business school academics and business school students are going to go in and make a difference? I don't see that narrative. I don't think we're nearly as confident and as assertive as we should about the ability of our academic staff and our student populations to make a difference in the organisations in which they're.
Yes, Robert.
As somebody who's coming from industry into business schools, one of the first questions I asked myself was, what is it that, especially university business schools, what is it that it adds to what is the best thing that it can offer to the outside world? And I've come to the conclusion that it's a cultivation of what I call relational thinking. I've written a few pieces on what I use the term relevate, to make the seemingly irrelevant relevant. It's an invented word combination. But the point I'm trying to get at is that it's about educating our students who will go out to become managers to think about the big and the small in relation to one another. William Blake's idea of seeing the world in a grain of sand, and vice versa. Seeing the wood and the trees, not all the trees. The relationship between these two are inextricable. Seeing ourselves as part of this ecological connection to the world, and not the world as a resource, but as a source.
Yes, Richard?
Yeah, as the author of a textbook, what has happened over the last 20 years, and it supports what both Roberts have said, is that there has been a move now towards more use of more electronic work, this sort of idea of a textbook that has the sort of profundity and sort of perceived wisdom and so on and so forth. Yes, it's there and it has a role, but the technology has changed so much over the last 20 years that there now needs to be, and it applies certainly to higher education and in the business schools, totally new ways of thinking. So me, for example, 4 or 5 years ago at Milano Istituto Politecnico, with a large class of MBAs, of very, very high quality students, directly interacting with them during the course of a lecture discussion, you might call it. These days, I think that could be done just as well by Zoom, or nearly as well by Zoom. And all that means to me is that the higher education institutions need to thoroughly rethink how they communicate and get the best and support their students over a period of time.
Yes, Paula?
Yeah, so on the question of, bravery and publications, I think we all live in that world as editors and reviewers, as well as submitting to journals. Maybe there's a small crack in the landscape right now that we, given that we on this panel, we the audience right now, are part of this community, could address. I've seen stuff about how rapid science is being developed around possible vaccines and possible kinds of ways of treating this, which would normally, you couldn't get a thing to market unless you had thoroughly tested it. And it's, it's big bet stuff. In fact, we write those of us who do that kind of strategy, about real options when you're taking big bets on things that may never come to market. So in that sense, right now, we're dismissing all that. We want a cure for this so badly that we're allowed to go to human testing very fast. Is this a chance for management theory to do the same, to say, yes, we need some peer review, but no, we don't need to have 3.5 years of peer review before we could accept your work. Perhaps it's time that we, as a scholarly community, I mean, I don't think there's a room for, well, I made this up, and so that's good enough and you should accept it. I mean, I think we need a little balance somewhere between those things. But at the same time, yes, we do need some radical new ways of thinking. And I think that we are the people sitting here on this panel, and sort of also we, the people who are sitting here editing and reviewing papers, to say, this has something really interesting. How can we work with the interestingness of this to make it also sufficiently valid for others to build on, as opposed to this is interesting but disconnected. I believe it is our job to start doing that, to make our known ways of sciencing in business a little bit more responsive, as opposed to a barrier to entry.
Thank you. Robert Macintosh?
So Paula points to an ongoing challenge which predates pandemic. How do you get interesting work out into the world? And of course, some of the theories that we try to publish in these settings point to the difficulty that that's exactly what you have to do. You have to be outside the system in order to innovate. That's the Kuhnian argument and so on. I do think there's a difference between our theory-led publications, and I am of the view as I get older and older that there aren't that many new theories actually. There's just interesting new takes on existing theories, and our empirically led theorizing. And a really good question for our top-ranked peer-reviewed empirical journals is, which organizations are currently, as in right now, impressing you? And what is it that they're doing, and can we explain that? And of course that's laden with the risk that Paula herself alluded to in her introductory remarks. We tend to eulogize the 7 steps to excellence or whatever, and then discover 5 years later that, oh, they were terrible and they've all gone bust. But there is a challenge to us to think, what is occurring right now in the organizations around us that's impressive? And organizations include governments and charities and public organizations and small businesses and large businesses. And to try and look at that impressive response, another phrase which has entered our lexicon in the last 50 or so days is this idea of pivoting. And it just resonates much more with us because we think, oh, isn't it amazing that the university sector has pivoted to online in less than 3 months? Oh, amazing. So what is impressive about the practice that we see, and why is it impressing us? And I think some of our best minds in this kind of setting are publishing scholars of strategy. That's the thing that would make me want to read their work, is here's an organization or a group of organizations that are responding in ways that impress me, and why.
Yes, Maureen?
Just to build on that point, I think some of the organisations that are seen to have pivoted, like universities that have moved quickly to online, actually they were doing some of it anyway, some of the ones who were further down the line anyway. So for me, there's a lesson there about resilience, and let's look at those organisations that are doing interesting things, and maybe it's a real options approach, as has been mentioned already, who are perhaps testing things out. And yes, sometimes you put some resources into a project which you then don't go on to invest in a big way, but for me, that's one of the lessons here. Arguably, the universities have been too slow to move into online teaching, and what's happened here has given us a massive shove in a direction that we should have been moving faster in anyway. But I think some of the organisations that are doing well in the current environment are doing well because they had thought a little bit, and they had prepared, and they had tested some innovative approaches. Anyway, that's one of the things that I think I'm seeing.
So can I just add on to the end of that, Maureen, that this is a good example of us doing our practice live in the digital room, as it were, because your observation is that the organisations that might have impressed us most were actually secretly behind the scenes already thinking about some of this stuff. So it's not just on the spur of the moment, it's an opportunity for them to respond in ways that they were already thinking about. And earlier, Paula, when she was talking about the innovation of bringing your digital donkey sanctuary to your Zoom meeting, used a particular phrase, and I can't escape the field researcher in me. I still scribble stuff down. So I heard Paula say, we retrospectively reconstruct people who were lucky in their pivoting. That's the phrase that Paula used. And I think that's true. And so that's a really good example of the kind of theorizing. Don't be impressed by Blogs and Co.'s amazing pivot. Realize that in 2 or 3 years in the lead up to that pivot, they'd already been thinking about this. What's that telling us about the practice of preparing for uncertain circumstances? That's really interesting thinking. I'd want to read that. What I wouldn't want, to be blunt, is to read that in 5 years' time once it's survived triple blind review and the queue for publication in a forthcoming issue of something, because by then it's too late. I'd be interested in reading that next week. That would really interest me. And I'd be willing to countenance the risk that the bibliography wasn't quite right and they hadn't cited quite enough of my work.
That is a good point you're leading into.
Well, that's very big of you. I'm not sure I would, quite frankly, if they hadn't cited me enough, but good on you, Robert One.
There are some questions also from practitioners or towards business practice. Sujata asked, what strategies do you think the small and medium scale enterprises adopt post-COVID to deal with the challenges created? And 2 similar ones that also ask about, should SMEs specifically spend more time on thinking and reflecting as they had in an enforced way right now to improve business practice?
Can I come in there? Just initially to say that there's a whole area of entrepreneurial strategy also we've not discussed really today. And I think that relates particularly obviously to small businesses and the whole business, again, if I may come back to innovation and rethinking what is actually important about what we're doing and how we could do it differently and how we can look at opportunities that will arise. And there's a whole series of theories on that have some relevance. May I just very briefly comment on something that was said earlier on? I think there are enormous pressures on academics at the moment. We were having a discussion with regard to research. We were having a discussion recently, I won't say which area it was, but all the 4-star journals, research journals, in this particular area would only accept highly quantitative surveys. Anything else was impossible to get published. And I do think that is a significant retrograde step and not helpful to the future of business studies. But back to the point of small business, innovate, please.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, trying to answer or at least respond to that SME concern. If I may, I just keep reminding myself of what Dyson did. If you remember, his vacuum cleaner was developed on the basis of the fact that he was frustrated that he was not able to see the dirt that was being sucked up. It's such a simple thing, but it's about very, very astute observation that we, as people cleaning the room and so forth, we want to see feedback from our efforts. And that's the reason why he produced this transparent plastic containers where you can actually see literally the dust being sucked up. And that gives you, and that gave his vacuum cleaners the competitive advantage. So the advantage comes from being observant about what really potential customers are frustrated about. So that's the starting point for strategy, not some abstract notion.
I'm loving the idea, Robert, that our journal editors could show us in a transparent tube the rubbish that they're sucking out of our papers.
If I may, if I be, I'm allowed to digress a little bit. If you go to Freud, maybe Freud had something to say about how Dyson discovered this thing. You know, if you put your child on the potty, the one thing that you want the child to do is deposit. So and then you reward the child for actually delivering. And that's really what it's all about.
That's why I miss having you as a colleague, Robert.
No, that's
Yes, I mean, this is all part of the whole unconscious psyche.
moving on most likely to the last question, looking at the time is, and just to everybody, the slides will be available to you, which the panelists have agreed to. Also, the video will be available to you once this has finished, and it will be communicated. I wanted to ask a question to the panel. If you were approached, or you could give advice to the government and Boris Johnson, how, and the question is of how, of the strategy making, how to strategically organize the return to full free movement in personal and business life, what would you suggest? It's the how, not actually the what, but the how. How should it be done, communicated, organized?
Okay, let me sort of kick it off. I think what they're doing step by step, gingerly, slowly is right. But a few things I would add on. First, airports temperature scan. Okay, entrance to every building temperature scan. Sanitizers at every entrance, and face masks in every public. It has taken us so long, my goodness. We would have saved lives, in my view. Okay, so simple things like this.
Robert.
So I would add a very serious attempt to educate people on the transmission process. So the length of time and the space that you are in and the proximity to other people. I read something that Shaz Ansari from Cambridge, the Judge Institute of Cambridge, posted, I think, on LinkedIn this morning. And I only intended to glance at it, and I found myself riveted for the 10 or 15 minutes it took me to read, because it was actual empirical data about, how many people in a restaurant end up infected depends on
Absolutely.
how long you were there, where you were sitting, what the air conditioning system was doing,
Absolutely
and the
right.
risk that you're taking by choosing to do that. So the two things I would add to Robert's excellent list are an education campaign based on transmission, so that people can make informed choices. And the second thing is, I would not be in a rush, not because of the health benefits of not losing our loved ones, which is a tragedy, but because I don't think that the back to normal was all that attractive. I am not that keen to get back in my car and spend hundreds of hours a day or a year getting to some building or other to simply do things that I'm doing without all that commuting, without all that CO2, and with poorer and more impoverished sense of participation and voice. I think we should be trying to say to people, think carefully about what you want normal to look like and make informed choices. And just in case this is my last opportunity to say, I thank you to the panel for fantastic insights, and I have enjoyed the wide-ranging conversation, which I didn't expect to get from James Dyson to potties, but that's just life with Robert.
Richard?
I think I would obviously agree with all those points. I simply would add that we're not going to go back to normal. We're going to go back to a new state where communication is done differently, and we need, in my view, to set up some sort of strategic, innovative think tank that will come up with some ideas that takes that particular approach of a new normal, and also addresses the other issue that I addressed, and at least one other person addressed, and I apologize for not remembering who it was, about, Paul, I think it was you, sustainability is not going to go away. It is fundamental to where we go over the next few years, and we need to be still thinking about that now. So I don't apologize for raising that issue again.
Maureen, and then
just at the if I think of it at the organisational level, so some of the businesses that are trying to get back to normal, I think one thing I'd really like to see is a way of thinking that goes beyond, you know, picking a particular direction of travel and sticking to it. You know, we've learned so much about dealing with uncertainty and the fact that events we might think of as improbable do sometimes happen. So a sort of thinking that is data driven, which trajectory are we on? Should we be looking for certain trigger points and perhaps switching direction as we go along? I would love to think that as we recover from this, some businesses and some organisations will just have a slightly different approach to their strategic thinking, which goes beyond, you know, picking a direction and sticking to it, but a reflection of the fact that we can't predict the future, and that it's really helpful to be data driven and to look for trigger points and to look for some of those signals that, you know, perhaps the world is changing, or perhaps we need to be shifting the balance in certain ways. So I'd love to see some of that carried forward as a result of what we've all been living through in the past few months.
Paula.
So I agree with the points on the data and the sort of informed choices, and I think they're very important. Without those, we can't do anything effective. On the other hand, I think we also need to incorporate within that the notion that this is still ambiguous, that data will not give us answers, and indeed this may be a virus that has no vaccination, and that the best we can hope for is that we learn to live in a world that has this forever. That is one of the proposals being put out by the World Health Organization right now, that, you know, this could be like HIV, which we have not actually solved. So under the circumstances, I think we need to both take the best science and data we have to make informed risk, but also perhaps if I was government, I would be doing quite a lot on strategic ambiguity and the fact that rather than poor communication or a vague communication, that well-expressed rhetoric can take that ambiguity and make it look like it serves everybody's interests. And I think that's very important. At the moment, I see far too much polarization of old versus young and things like that. If I read one more thing that says the old people are going to have to make it up to the young people, I'm really going to scream. That was in the FT 2 days ago. What did the old people do to make this pandemic deliberately start doing this to the young people, that they have to make it up to them? That is polarized. That is driving interest wedges between society. Strategic ambiguity make everybody think their interest is being met, and they will come to collective action with understanding or same understanding. Let's work towards that thing instead of driving wedges that make interests go in opposite directions.
Thank you. Is there anything anybody of the panelists would like to say before I close? Then I am most delighted and most grateful for all of you, dear colleagues, to have come together for 90 minutes to discuss amongst each other and with a number of people in the audience. As you have seen, we weren't able to answer all of the questions. However, some were directly at particular colleagues, whether there was a name in. These will be sent on to the colleagues and we will collect answers. So your questions will not be lost in space, in cyberspace. Thank you very much also for everybody who contributed to running the panel. Alan here with me, but also my colleagues in the BARM head office, as we call it, particularly Raluca Stroh, who has been absolutely amazing in the background in the run up to the event. And today, can only say through her, I know the feedback has been absolutely amazing to the event. Thank you for everybody who came and joined us. And I hope I will see you soon and think of joining us at BARM at some point in the near future. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, and thank you, Alan. Yeah.
Bye, folks. Thanks for hosting.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all.
Yes, thank you.
Likewise, stay safe all. Stay safe.